The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Are you making the most of your KiwiSaver investment? Generate is an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of strong long-term performance. Making a smart decision now could add tens of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement. Book a no-obligation chat with a Generate KiwiSaver advisor today at generatekiwisaver.co.nz/getadvice. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
Estou passando nesse podcast para dividir uma informação que fez toda a diferença na minha vida. Quer fazer pós-graduação, mas tá impossível correr de um lugar para o outro?
Pois é, ainda mais com o trânsito.
Então você precisa conhecer a educação à distância do Senac. Sabia que é nota máxima no MEC? E tem diversos cursos de pós-graduação para te levar ainda mais longe. 100% online, sem necessidade de TCC e com acesso direto a todos os professores.
Ah, saber isso fez diferença sim.
Inscreva-se já na pós-graduação EAD. Quer saber? Senac EAD.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. This is Gone by Lunchtime. My name is Toby Manhire, and we are here on Thursday, March 28. It's now 13 days since the attacks in Christchurch, in which 50 members of the Christchurch Muslim community were murdered while they were worshipping. Annabelle Lee is with me, Ben Thomas is with me. Annabelle, it was a kind of astonishing moment, and everybody around the country tried to come to terms with what had happened as it unfolded on that Friday afternoon.
Yeah, I think at first there was like a news alert sent out saying that gunshots had been heard near a mosque in Christchurch. And initially I actually didn't think very much of it. I just thought, it's some person who's accidentally let off a firearm while cleaning it or something, because those things simply do not happen here in New Zealand. And then soon after there were reports that 6 people were dead, and we turned on the television in the office and there was that really startling photo of the police, the armed offenders outside the hospital, because there was reports of a possible shooting there, and all of the information started to flow through, and just an absolutely terrifying, shocking, unbelievable, unfathomable thing to have happened here in modern times in Aotearoa.
Ben, how did it unfold for you?
Yeah, well, I was just at work, probably like most people. Same kind of thing. I think the first thing I saw about it was a tweet, that shots had been heard. I immediately thought, possibly a disgruntled ex-husband, stalking around with an air rifle or a .22, who was going to be sort of picked up in short order. Then there were reports of, the first casualties, and obviously, news organisations try to be sort of conservative about this, until things are confirmed. So, even though it was, essentially a massacre, and it all kind of happened at once, the toll sort of, rose through the afternoon as sort of facts could be established. So I think, I heard that, there were 6 dead, and then I emerged from a sort of 2-hour meeting and it was 49, it's like Annabelle said, it's the sort of thing that it seems incomprehensible in New Zealand. We have had this sort of kind of cultural buffer, I think, in the sense that, not only have police been, talking to government for, a decade now, about reforming the gun laws in New Zealand. But, you know, I had talked to people who had been, you know, working in that area last year who had been saying, you know, this actually needs to be urgently addressed. You know, this is extremely lax. And, you know, because of that kind of sort of sense of cultural complacency where we have, well, that just doesn't happen in New Zealand. New Zealanders don't do that. You know, I didn't even, you know, I never even sort of turned my mind to the realities of what they were talking about. You know, you just kind of assume, well, that won't, you know, ever be the case here.
And I guess that is the cultural divide, Ben, because, you know, for people like us, we've never thought that anything like that could possibly happen here in Aotearoa, but for members of the Muslim community, they have been raising red flags for, you know, quite some time that, you know, perhaps not of this level, but certainly something quite serious could happen because they experience the really ugly side of racism and Islamophobia in New Zealand every day, just doing simple things like going out to buy groceries, driving in their car, dropping off their tamariki at school. So I think, you know, for me, that's been one of the really compelling insights too, is realising that, you know, the experience of Muslims living in New Zealand is not perhaps what we would like to think it is.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's, you know, not, you know, totally accepting that. I think there's, you know, in terms of, you know, which you can't, but if you take away, you know, the sort of the context of it, I think everyone kind of accepted that eventually New Zealand would sort of be subject to a terrorist attack of some kind, you know, from whatever source. But I think nobody really expected the scale, you know, of this and really ever thought that was plausible, you know. And because, you know, as, you know, we've seen actually, you know, with probably the exception of white supremacist attacks, you know, the death toll in terrorist attacks overseas has actually sort of gone down over the last few years. You know, it kind of bumps up and then comes down as authorities get better at dealing with different threats. So yeah, it you know,
and one of the things that was striking, I think, to a lot of people, and that I include myself in that, was just how lax our gun laws really were, just how really straightforward it was with a Category A license to purchase military-style semi-automatic weaponry, you know, or to put it together if you just got the component parts. You know, just order it off the internet. I mean, extraordinary. Were you surprised by that, Annabelle?
Yes and no. You know, I think Heather Duplessis-Allen, although it wasn't specifically about semi-automatic rifles, I think she showed how incredibly lax our gun laws are. They haven't been changed in 26 years. You know, successive governments have had plenty of opportunity to do something about it and haven't. But, yeah, it is disturbing to think that someone who is clearly unhinged and made no bones about his political views all over social media and 8chan and all of those places, was able to, you know, purchase weapons like that online and carry out an atrocity.
Particularly because, you know, what we're seeing, you know, in America and now in New Zealand, is what the British writer Laurie Penny described as basically gig economy fascism. So, you know, these mass murderers, starting off with Columbine and, you know, through to the present day, you know, most of them are not people who have been in trouble with the law previously. The exception to that is generally domestic violence. And they, you know, and in many cases, they've purchased the arms very shortly before the attacks. So they don't have a history of, you know, any kind of bad behaviour, you know, in a legal sense that would sort of raise red flags. I think the most compelling argument for the gun reform that was obviously inevitable anyway, you know, once the attack had happened, actually came from the owner of Gun City, in an extraordinary interview that he did, where he admitted that he sold 2 weapons that could be converted to military-style semi-automatics, over the internet to this guy, and said there was nothing that raised any flags with them, and they had no reason to believe there would be a problem with that, which I think is the best reason why you can't have that kind of model ever. You can't rely on somebody whose job is to make a margin selling guns being the gatekeeper between mass deaths and society.
Yeah, that was an extraordinary moment when David Tipple, is that his name, gave that press conference in which he refused to answer any questions beyond the very details of the transaction in which these weapons were sold. I haven't heard him pipe up since. He's in the past been quite a vocal opponent of tightening gun rules. He's threatened court action in relation to his ability to be able to import certain weapons. He's was once convicted in America of attempting to take firearms onto an aeroplane in his check-in baggage without having cleared correctly. He was once recorded speeding at 181 kilometres an hour in his Audi.
That's quite fast.
The depths of the... so he's a kind of unwelcome presence in this whole debate. On the gun law reform thing, though, just quickly on that, the speed with which the proposed reforms were turned around, which included a kind of interim measure of pushing up the requirement to an E category license, I think.
Yeah, so immediately
the law going through.
Yes.
That was done, Ben. I mean, you've been closer to that kind of policy engine than many of us. That's probably the sort of thing that would normally take 6 months, 9 months to work through, wouldn't it?
Yeah, look, in the ordinary course of business, developing, working up a cabinet paper, you would probably do consultation, although I think the need for that is completely gone now. And then you'd work something through the normal legislative process. So you'd be looking at probably about a year and a half to completion, probably. Obviously, that's not an option right now. If there's anything that we've seen from attacks like this overseas, particularly the United States, particularly post-Columbine, is that they set out a blueprint which anyone can follow. And if you don't disrupt the ability to follow that blueprint, they will happen again. When Columbine happened, I thought, that's a uniquely awful one-off. That kind of erupted into reality, and now it's so normal in the United States that you have Indiana teachers getting practice shot in the neck by rubber bullets just to prepare them for the next school siege. So they did move very quickly. They had a bit of a blueprint for it, which was for gun reform, which was the Australian model after the Port Arthur massacre. The reforms that the government are introducing are not as extensive as the Australian reforms. So they're getting rid of these, guns that can be turned into military-style semi-automatics, which I'm told it's something to do with being centre fire rather than rim fire. And when you look at the sort of difference between those bullets, between the semi-automatics that are being banned and the semi-automatics that will still be available, they're sort of 3 times as big and basically just designed to kill people. So in Australia, sort of semi-automatic 22s, just your normal kind of farm rifle, are restricted. You have to get a special license to have one of those, and you basically have to be a farmer or a pest controller to be able to buy one of those in Australia. In New Zealand, the Prime Minister was a bit slippery with her words. She said we'd reached the same point as Australia by simply not banning those guns, and it was the same as Australia because only farmers had them anyway, which is not strictly true, but people who know about these things seem to think that the difference is pretty marginal, and that it's not a huge public risk, at least in terms of the ability to sort of slaughter dozens of people at once in the same way as Christchurch. Can I digress somewhat and just go back to your point about Columbine? I actually read a book that was written by Dylan Klebold's mother on what happened there, and I think
for anyone who works in the media or is going to be in a position where they're going to be reporting on this issue or, God forbid, stories like it, I think it's a really important read because it talks about issues and it's a discussion that we need to have as the media for those mass shooters. Naming the number or putting a number on how many people have been killed or injured is a really dangerous thing because essentially it becomes an aspirational target that subsequent shooters try to outdo each other. So I think we need to think really carefully in the media about, how we report on, the number of dead, the number, of injured in a way that actually does honour the individuals who have lost their lives, but also doesn't create an atmosphere where other potential shooters are wanting to outdo that. The other thing too is I think we need to be careful about comparing, mass shootings like Columbine to what happened in Christchurch because Christchurch was clearly politically motivated. Whereas Columbine was, one deeply depressed child and another child who was probably a sociopath, and by chance sort of mostly, did target black children, but it wasn't based on a awful political philosophy or anything. So I think it's important to differentiate those things. And that was one of the things that I found interesting about the media coverage to begin with was how long it actually took for us to call it a terrorist attack in the media and international reporting. When we see these types of situations, we often refer to them very quickly as a suspected terrorist attack. But it really wasn't until the following day that the media started doing that. And I'm not sure if that's because we're so inexperienced about reporting these issues in our own country that we weren't sure, when do you start to call it a suspected terrorist attack or a terrorist attack, or if it's because of just, And
part of that is the different world that we sort of live in from, the terrorism of old. Terrorism used to be conducted by groups or organizations, the IRA, anarchist societies, way 100 years ago. Now it's, people have struggled kind of with this concept of the lone wolf, where they're like, oh, it was just, one individual. But of course, these individuals, Al-Qaeda set this, they started this pattern, using the internet to sort of radicalize individuals who would never have any contact with the leadership hierarchies, but would be subscribing to the same doctrine, would have the sort of information available because of the internet and news coverage of how to, perpetrate a terrorist attack, and and have the same goals. And so there is this, there has been a bit of fuzziness, I think, in terms of whether people are sort of, lone wolf terrorist attack. But I think, in an everyday sense, it's certainly a terrorist attack. Actually, a good point was raised by a retired judge who said that the reason that you might not want to prosecute it as a terrorist, as a terrorist act, rather than just as a murder, is, there has been a lot of discussion about, is the defendant going to try and use the trial as an opportunity to spout his insane views, and become a celebrity of the worst kind, or even worse, a meme, which is really what these guys are after. And in order to prove terrorism charges, you have to prove that it had a kind of ideological motive. And whereas murder, you don't need to prove anything about motive, and so you don't need to get into that evidence.
Right.
And there's, on that point, and the fact of responsibly reporting, Jacinda Ardern, who we'll come to in a moment, was very clear on that point. She called it terrorism in her second press conference after she returned from New Plymouth. And she was also quite very strong in declaring that she would not name him.
the offender.
And most media have followed that along. I mean, obviously there are different imperatives for people who work in news reporting. I heard his name used twice
during one RNZ report last night, and very quickly a lot of people wrote in and complained, and Lisa Owen read that out. So.
Someone was telling me, actually it was someone I was talking to who works in a newsroom in London, who I was talking to about this, said that actually they couldn't remember what the guy's name was. So it's kind of interesting that seems to generally...
I actually can't. I can remember a few consonants.
Right, yeah. But, I want to go back though, or just briefly, just on that point of online radicalisation, white supremacy, I would just recommend people have a look at a piece that we've run on the Spin-Off this morning by someone called Bharath Ganesh, who's a researcher on white supremacist, white victimhood, and how that works online. He talks about a swarm, and it's exactly what you're describing, Ben, in terms of the way that all those kind of memes and tropes metastasize online, and so they kind of have these shared narratives and shared grudges, but they don't actually need to necessarily even be in direct communication with one another. But I want to go back, Annabelle, to the point you made early on about the reality of being a Muslim in New Zealand, and there was one of the really powerful contributions in the days following was from Anjum Rahman, who is the chair, I think, of the Islamic Women's Council, or certainly the spokesperson of the Islamic Women's Council. And it was an extremely, she wrote an extremely powerful piece which we published as did RNZ. She appeared on your program, The Hui, and she basically said, don't come and tell us this occurred out of the blue or that it was unexpected. We've been bloody telling you this. We've been trying to bash down the doors in Wellington to tell people about this for years.
Yeah, they'd spoken to the SIS. One of the things she said that I thought was interesting is since the rise of ISIS, hate crimes and abuse and threats towards the Muslim community have massively increased, and of course, with the rise of social media as well, it's difficult for them to escape. So one of the things that I have to say on the day, I felt emotionally like I was swinging between feeling, upset and mamai and podi, and feeling so angry that this had been allowed to occur on in our country, particularly when the offender had been so open about his intentions on social media. And I thought about people like Tami Iti and Te Rangi Kemara and Urs Signer and those ones, and what they went through, and the amount of effort that had been put into the two Hoi raids. And yet here was a white supremacist who was able to post pictures of, his weapons and magazines all over Twitter with, people's names written all over them, and where were our intelligence communities? It's a lot of questions still to be answered around that, and I think Matthew Hooton raised some really good points about it when he thought that the head of the SIS should have offered her resignation immediately, and I have to say that I agree with him.
Well, yeah, and it may be yet that Andrew Little, who knows, faces further questions as he's in charge of that portfolio, because the question really is, were they looking the wrong way, isn't it?
I have to say, is it just another example of institutional racism in New Zealand that they're so busy running around after, people in the Urewera and supposed Māori nationalists and the Muslim community, that they weren't keeping an eye on what's happening in terms of white nationalism and the white supremacist movement here.
Gamal Fauda, who's the imam at Al Noor Mosque, which was where I think 42 people were killed, gave a very powerful speech at Hagley Park last Friday. And one of the things he said was, the martyrdom of 50 people and the injury of 42 did not come overnight. It was the result of the anti-Muslim rhetoric of some political leaders, media agencies and others. And that kind of goes to that question. You said, Annabelle, that on that Friday afternoon I certainly felt that this sort of thing doesn't happen in New Zealand. And there was some, the immediate response was, this isn't us, this isn't us. And, I can understand exactly that sentiment. And yet, over the days that followed, the hours and days, there was a growing sense that actually that's a bit simplistic. There is...
Absolutely.
It is us.
Terrorism isn't us, and, shooting people en masse in their place of worship isn't us. But racism is absolutely us, and the denial of racism is absolutely us, and it's been allowed to continue after this event. And it's interesting when you see people on Twitter who, have helped ramp up that environment, doing the whole peace and love. It's okay, let's not politicise this issue. The white defensiveness that occurred in the days afterwards was an illustration that this is exactly us. We do have a massive problem with racism in New Zealand, and we're absolutely in denial about it.
Where I think it's particularly important is, you don't want to police people's grief. Everybody processes, tough times in their own ways. Social media probably doesn't encourage people to put their best views forward immediately. So I think there were a lot of bad reactions all around, and it probably took about a week until, we could focus on sort of, going after people's bad takes rather than just sort of reflecting on what had happened. But I think, where, I don't think it's particularly productive to start pointing fingers at people and saying that they have blood on their hands and some of the sort of more fiery kind of rhetoric that's followed this. Where the wider environment is very important is that, the root of most of the terrible things that humans do to each other is, dehumanization or, to use sort of university language, othering. Seeing people who are different to yourself, whether because of race or religion or sex, as sort of fundamentally different to you and less human than you. And that doesn't require, overt racism or hostility. What it requires is just sort of, ignorance or alienation or... Media Watch reported, I think, last week that, there were 13,000, news stories. Was it 13,000 over a period?
Yeah, preceding.
Yeah,
what happened in Christchurch.
That mentioned Muslims or Islam, and 12,000 of them had references to terrorism. And, I probably didn't meet a Muslim New Zealander until I was about 25 years old. And that was post 9/11. Pretty much everything that I'd ever heard or read about Islam was through the lens of the 9/11 attacks and what was happening in Afghanistan and Iraq, And when I finally met a coworker, it doesn't reflect well on me. It sounds very unworldly. I was pretty surprised to learn that he was just an ordinary Fijian Indian guy who took his family to Mount Roskill KFC every second Sunday because that's when they had halal fried chicken, and it's, if I could have that experience like in the early 2000s, I don't think there's any reason why, that's not the same experience that other people are having growing up. Not, they don't meet or interact with Muslim New Zealanders, or they don't know that they do. And there is this constant association between Islam and terrorism in the news because, peaceful people going about their business, working, getting married, having families, attending mosque, every week doesn't make the news. And so unless you're exposed to that, you will sort of, unconsciously have these negative associations where you somehow think that, your neighbours are different from you because of the way that they worship or because of the group they belong to.
You will particularly have those views too when you have people in key positions in the media with a big platform who get to criticise you, and you have no way to respond to those things. So that's part of the problem too, is that in New Zealand, our media landscape is dominated by white middle-class men who lean to the right, and we don't have equal representation on the other side of the political spectrum. So we have Mike's Minute, but we don't have Moana's Minute or Tamiiti Time. We have, we have a number of commentators on the right, but we don't have an equal number of commentators on the left. And I've had this discussion with a colleague who, is a big supporter of free speech and says, I think people should just be allowed to say whatever we want, and we have to be big enough and grown up to hear it. And in theory, I agree with it. But actually, when only one side has a platform, that doesn't work. And people say, but there's Twitter. Twitter is not the same as being in a publication like stuff. It doesn't have the mana or the perceived credibility of an organisation like the Herald. So until New Zealand, and I think this has been a stunning example of, we've all been running around using the same Muslim commentators and spokespeople over the last few weeks because there's such a paucity of them in the media that we know of. We haven't had, in the past there hasn't been a regular column for a Muslim person in Stuff or in the Herald or whatever. And
or on the spin-off, by the way.
Or on the spin-off, and I think it's an issue that as the media we need to get serious about and address so that we have equal representation across the political spectrum, across, New Zealand's communities, and we have strong ethnic representations right across the board.
I'm very, very here for Tamiiti Time and Moana's Minute.
Moana's Minute would be so good.
Which you can do, or maybe we should do it. Try and...
Moana Maniapoto. Oh, no, Moana Jackson. Or Moana Maniapoto. Or both Moana, of the Moanas.
Or Moana from the film.
Yeah, all three.
It's going to be our new podcast.
I think there should be a bit of caution about. I think that point is absolutely correct. We do need more diversity in the media. We should hear from as many voices as possible. We should hear about things that are happening in the community, that aren't all just, that aren't crimes or accidents or, the things that, the it bleeds, it leads kind of news. This shouldn't be a left-right thing. Traditionally the right in New Zealand, at least over the last sort of 20 or 30 years has been more international in terms of, links with the world, in terms of welcoming immigrants. I don't see that as the key cleavage here. And I think it's a little unfortunate that people are trying to make that. At the same time, I think there are people on the right in New Zealand politics who probably actually need to get back to their roots a bit more and start thinking about things in terms of the free movement of, people across borders as well as money and goods, and the sort of, the kind of tolerance that should really come along with free market ideas. And all of our political parties have, given in probably the worst angels of their nature over the last 10 years or so. We saw it with Labour with, Chinese sounding names. We saw it with National with their bizarre sort of opposition to the UN Compact on Migration. And hopefully there's been reflection on all parts. I think, if you look at social media, it's easy to think that everyone's getting into defensive crouches and that, people are just sort of trying to, sort of spray blame around. But I think that, in real life, in an actual society, people are actually thinking about what the events of the last, week and a half mean and what it means for how they look at New Zealand and the world and how they act and how they go forward.
I disagree. I think that only applies to a certain sector of New Zealand because, even on was it the Friday where they were encouraging women to wear headscarves, there was all sorts of reports about, people, pretending to shoot women who were wearing them and pretending to cut their throats and being verbally abusive and stuff. So I think perhaps in our bubble, Ben, a lot of people are thinking about, how we interact with those communities and what we do and what sort of New Zealand we want to create. But I don't think that translates everywhere. And I think that, for some segments of New Zealand society, it absolutely hasn't resonated that way.
Let's talk a bit about the political response. Jacinda Ardern has made headlines around the world. There's no getting around that. Some of them kind of gushing, some of them losing a sense of proportion, arguably even. But we should look at the way she responded politically to the situation. She was very decisive. She very early on set down some quite clear kind of, almost like a kind of defined the terms of the story. She tried to focus as much as possible on the families, on the community, make it as inclusive as possible. She, as touched on before, very early on in her second press conference in Wellington, defined it as an act of terrorism. She refused to name the alleged offender. She spoke out on the role of Facebook, which I don't think we'll bother with this week. Maybe come back to that another time. She talked about how that they cannot avoid their responsibility to address some very serious issues, they and other online platforms. She pushed through gun law reform at quite remarkable pace. And she also, although she said she didn't think deeply about it, for her it was just an act of respect, she wore a hijab, a headscarf, when she went to visit the families on the Saturday following in Christchurch. And that image, images just are. We all know that. We all work in some way in the media, though. The power of images. That had an incredible impact. It reverberated.
What more could we possibly have asked her to do? I think I really can't think of anything more she could have done to lead our country through this situation. I think she's done a really magnificent job. I was talking to my mum about this the other day, and she has an interesting theory, which is, Jacinda seems to be particularly good in a crisis. And my mum wondered if perhaps that was being the daughter of a police officer, a former police officer, if she's, sort of been around someone who's used to having to step up in a crisis and manage a crisis and be empathetic and lead people through it. And I thought, potentially that she's quite right. I think she's done an amazing job. What I'm interested to see is, Ben, you'll know more about this than me, but when immigrants come to a country, they tend to vote for the government that's in power at the time because they feel a sense of loyalty and appreciation towards them. And I'm wondering how her management of this issue may impact Labour's support in terms of our New Zealanders. The other thing too is it was really heartening to see the way The leader of the National Party responded as well in terms of being supportive of the reforms to the gun laws, and I think, as leader of the opposition, he's done a good job too. I know, Ben, that you were frustrated by how long it took for National to come out and declare their support of that, and it's been interesting because
I thought it would have been a good opportunity for Bridges to show some leadership of his own by actually just coming out and saying we'll support a ban, immediately,
straight away,
rather than being passive. But I mean, I think that's pretty trivial in terms of how things have actually turned out. My concern there was that New Zealand First has had links with the gun lobby, and so whatever was negotiated between Labour and New Zealand First, sort of behind closed doors, would probably end up being the situation. Fortunately, New Zealand First have not been immune to what happened on Friday, and last Friday, and so we got sensible reform.
They've been very quiet, New Zealand First, on this. It's interesting.
I think that's very wise for them.
Ron Mark's all over the Colfo Facebook page. They're big fans of Ron Mark.
Winston Peters did travel to Turkey to the Islamic International Organisation, name of which I can't remember exactly, but
he kept pretty quiet there as well.
Yeah, he was fairly quiet there, but that was at his own suggestion, I believe, and it was important to get someone over there to talk to Erdogan, who was busy turning what had happened into a campaigning tool, rather cynically. But as for the Prime Minister's performance, her response, Ben, what's your view on that?
Outstanding. I mean, I struggle to think of a better Prime Minister we could have had at this time. Jacinda Ardern has sort of emotional intelligence that's kind of off the scale. And, for a crisis that, essentially is, a massive expression of grief. And, she has been, particularly good. I think a lot of times people sort of deride politicians' presentational skills. They can be criticised as style over substance, things like that. But actually at moments like this, and we saw it in Pike River as well, you do need, and the Christchurch earthquake, a lot of leadership is how well you're communicating, how well you're showing people that you understand, and showing them a sort of emotional way forward as well. And obviously, the Prime Minister has done, an incredible job of that.
I think another thing that's impressive too wasn't just the speed with which she responded in terms of changes to our gun laws, but also, talking about prioritising, sorting out the immigration status of those involved and their whānau, rallying ACC, offering to pay for all their funerals. I feel like potentially under our last government, those are things that would have been not really considered, but that she had the mind to consider all of those things and, most importantly, enact them, I think is, again, outstanding.
She's been asked about how those points I suggested about kind of setting the terms and defining the narrative or whatever. She said that wasn't on her mind at all, that what she was focused on was mostly on victim identification because of the importance in Islam for funerals to take place as quickly as possible. Thanks, guys. Thank you, Tina. Thanks to Flick Electric, who sponsor this podcast. One, for those 3 or 4 of you who've made it all the way to the end, I can give you this scoop, which is that after many years not drinking coffee, the Prime Minister, who's been focused on tea, has recently started drinking coffee again. That's a little scoop there for you. Has anyone else got anything else, or should we say farewell?
Farewell.
Farewell. There's loads more to discuss. We obviously didn't get across much of it there. We will talk again soon. I'm Toby Manhire, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the fourth Labour government. A podcast in 6 parts.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
This nation is at risk.
What do you think you're up to now, you perverted little liar?
I could smell the uranium on it as you lean towards the
most radical overhaul in the history of New Zealand's administration.
Juggernaut, the story of the fourth Labour government. Made with the support of New Zealand On Air. Listen now on The Spin-Off or wherever you get your podcasts.
Are you curious about how business can be better? I'm Simon Pound, and I host Business is Boring, a podcast where I kōrero with some of the most interesting people in entrepreneurship, commerce, and making things happen. Tune in to Business is Boring every Tuesday, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with Spark Business Lab.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.